The first astronomer we're going to talk about today, his name is Claudius Ptolemy. He was born back in 100 AD and died in 170 AD. Now, the way you say his name, make sure you say it correctly. So it's Ptolemy. It's got a silent P. A lot of students want to say Ptolemy. That is not correct. It's actually Ptolemy. This picture you see here is one of the only ones you'll find of him. I always think it's entertaining because he just, you look at him and you just wonder what he's thinking about. So could he be thinking something like this? Let's see. What is he thinking here? Is it, where are my keys? Maybe. Probably not. I don't know how many keys he probably had back then. Pull my finger. Well, if he's immature, he might be thinking that. Or could it be our solar system must be geocentric? So this is what Ptolemy is actually thinking about. And this is why he's famous. So Ptolemy is a Greek mathematician, and he's living in Alexandria, Egypt. So Alexandria, Egypt, we've talked about that place, very famous place known for several famous buildings, especially the library in Alexandria. And Ptolemy, Claudius Ptolemy, is actually a very important figure during this time, and he's actually the librarian in Alexandria. So he's very important, very powerful, and he gets a chance to go and study. And with those studies, he comes up with this idea of geocentrism. Now, geocentrism has already been around thanks to Pythagoras and Aristotle, but Ptolemy is able to explain it a whole lot better than Pythagoras and Aristotle can. So he's able to explain a couple things that Aristotle and Ptolemy can't. Aristotle and Pythagoras could not. So what does geocentric mean? Make sure you know this. This is very important. So if you look at this model here, you see where's the Earth? So the Earth is in the center. And then you've got the moon orbiting around the Earth, and then you have all the planets, including the sun, orbiting around the Earth as well. That's what geocentrism is. So the word geo means Earth, and then centric is Greek for center, so Earth-centered. This is the Earth-centered model of the universe, Earth being the center. The Earth does not move. Everything is moving around the Earth. Again, at this time, they believe that if the Earth were actually moving, you'd be able to feel it. And we now know today that that's not the case, but this was a very popular model at the time, and this model that Claudius Ptolemy comes up with lasts for over 1,400 years. That is kind of crazy when you think about it, that a model that is completely wrong can last for that long. So we're going to try to, I'm going to try to talk to you about why it lasted so long coming up in the next few slides. But geocentric, geo means Earth, centric means center, so it's a Earth-centered model of the universe. So he believed the Earth is the center of the solar system, and he had some evidence to back it up. So this is how he explained the movement of all the planets that no one else was able to explain back then. So if you look at the model, you see the Earth is in the center. You see the moon orbiting around the Earth, going counterclockwise. But then look at Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And you see they're not just orbiting around the Earth, no, but they're actually moving in circles as they orbit around the Earth. So Ptolemy was able to add in these circles. And these circles, those circles could actually explain the motion of the planets, because before this time, if you're looking up at, say, Venus, and you're watching Venus in the sky, you go outside one day during the month and you see Venus over here. You go outside 2 months later, Venus is over here. You go outside another month later, Venus is over here. But then you go outside the next month and you realize that Venus is not over here. It's actually moved backwards. So it moved back. No one was able to explain why planets would move forward in their orbits, but then move backwards. Claudius Ptolemy is the first person able to do that. And he did that by using these circles. So he said planets will orbit around the Earth in circles on top of circles. So these circles here that you see, these are called epicycles. And then these circles here at the actual orbit, those are called differents. So he was able to explain the movement of the planets moving back, forward and then backward by using epicycles. Got to know that. And the movement, the actual backwards motion of the planet. So if Venus is moving forward in its orbit going this way, it's moving forward. But right here, this is the backward motion of the planet. That backward motion is called retrograde motion. So retrograde means backwards. So he proposed this model in 140 AD. And this, I already told you, this theory would last for 1,400 years. That's a long time for something to be completely wrong. But still be used for that long. And the reason it was used for so long, there's a couple of reasons. We'll talk about them as we go here. But it did a decent job of actually explaining the motion of the planets. So it was actually pretty decent. So each planet travels in a circle while the circle itself went around the Earth. So again, the circle right here, this circle is called an epicycle. And then the orbit here, that's called a deferent. And then the backwards motion, so from Venus going from here to here, that is called retrograde motion. Retrograde. So Ptolemy's model did a fairly good job of predicting the motions of the planets, especially the retrograde motion. So again, if we see this planet here, we're taking a look at any of the planets here. So this would be Mars's orbit. So you can see Mars going forward, and as it's going forward, it takes this epicycle, and then once it gets here, it starts moving backwards. So this movement right here would be called the retrograde motion, and then it starts going forward again. So it's traveling along the deferent, enters into the epicycle, moves retrograde motion backwards in the epicycle, and then travels forward again. That's how Ptolemy was able to explain the motion of the cosmos. And of course, Aristotle says, what you talking about, Willis? Because Aristotle came up with this idea a long time ago before Ptolemy, but Aristotle was never able to explain the great retrograde motion. If you don't know who said this, what you're talking about, Willis, that's okay. It's an old show. It's called Different Strokes. A very famous guy was in it, Gary Coleman. It was a good show. I used to like that show, so that's why I throw that in there. So Aristotle and Pythagoras, they already had this idea of geocentrism, but Ptolemy is able to explain it with those epicycles, explaining the retrograde motion of the planets, all by saying planets are doing circles on top of circles as they're orbiting. I don't know if I would believe that back then or not if I lived back then. It's kind of hard to imagine living in a time when, they didn't even know that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. That's crazy if you think about it. Absolutely crazy. But then again, we also live in a time today where there's people that still believe that the Earth is flat. So, interesting stuff. That's Gary Coleman there. Okay, so how did Ptolemy fix Aristotle's problem? He created, what was it again? Motorcycles? No, it wasn't motorcycles. It was epicycles. So that's the word. You need to make sure you know what that is. Circles on top of circles as the planet moves. So there's Earth. This is the deferent right here, the orbit around the Earth. This is the epicycle. And then the backwards motion from here to here is called retrograde motion. Got to know that. That's what Ptolemy is famous for. This is his model that he used. It looks really confusing though. Look at that. Look how many circles there are drawn for each planet. That is a whole bunch of circles. It's too confusing for me to even try to think about how this would make sense, which is why I don't like Ptolemy's model. And I don't know if I would believe it if I lived back then or not, but you never know. So very confusing model, and that's why people that did not believe his model didn't believe in it, because they just thought it was too confusing. So we're going to talk about Occam's razor coming up in a few minutes with who comes next. The next person we talk about was able to change Ptolemy's model and come up with a different model. So please don't think that the planets are actually doing circles on top of circles, moving in epicycles. They are not. That is completely false. It's just a theory. It did a good job of explaining the motion, but it is wrong. So it is not correct. So yes, I call epicycles evil because it pretty much kept us back from moving forward in astronomy. But it lasted a long time. One of the reasons it lasted so long was because the Dark Ages happened. So from roughly 500 AD to 1500 AD, there was very little change in Ptolemy's model, geocentric model. That's because people were too busy dying from war and famine and diseases. So not much was going on with Europe in the Middle Ages. The Dark Ages. There was some stuff going on by Jewish and Arabic countries. They were able to make some observations with astronomy, but not much else was going on during the Dark Ages. Something else also happened. You need to know this. At about 1300 AD, the Earth, as the center of the universe started becoming a very popular belief in the Catholic Church. And so right around this time, the Catholic Church comes into power. And so who's the leader of the Catholic Church? You have the Pope. And so and a lot of people get confused as to why the Catholic Church would think that the Earth would care that the Earth is the center of the universe. A lot of people think they would care that the Earth is the center because that makes us feel special. You know, we're special, we're the center. But it's actually the opposite. So the Catholic Church believes that we are the center because we're in the middle because we are the closest to hell, actually. So all the planets, stars, moon, sun, they're all above us because they're closer to heaven. And then there's Earth down below, down in the middle, right near hell. So, in order to achieve spiritual enlightenment and move up, you have to be, a believer in the church, and so you'd move up. But if you didn't, you'd move down to hell. So that's really the reason the Earth, as the center of the universe, became so popular with the Catholic Church. It's not because we were special. It's because we were not special. That's why. So since they came to believe that the Earth is the center, any theory that said otherwise was vigorously suppressed, which means if you believed otherwise, they might label you a heretic, and then they could kill you. That happened several times throughout history, where they would actually burn you at a stake, cut your tongue out, just something along those lines to keep you from believing in other theories. So we'll talk more about that as we go, when we get to Galileo especially. Okay, next up we have Nicholas Copernicus. So Nicholas Copernicus, he's a Polish astronomer and mathematician, and he's famous for coming up with the heliocentric model of the universe. So we already know, we've heard from Aristarchus of Samos, who came up with this idea earlier, but Nicholas Copernicus is the one that really gets this new Copernican revolution going. And how he does that is he looks at Ptolemy's model and he just doesn't think it's correct. He thinks it's just too complicated. So Nicholas Copernicus, he actually works for the church. So he's a mathematician, and during this time period where he's working for the church, he studied canon law, and since he's a mathematician, he actually is working on calendar reform for the church. That's one big thing that I want you to understand is these guys that are coming out and saying heliocentric theory, they're not trying to battle the church. There's not this huge war between church and science. They're all, pretty much, they're high up in the church. They know people that are cardinals and popes in the church. They're friends with the people in the church, and they go to church. So they're not trying to, fight against the church, but it ends up becoming a big ordeal with the church because of the churches saying that the Earth is the center of the universe, and anything against that goes against the Bible. So Nicholas Copernicus, he's the first to actually publish a book saying heliocentric theory. And he does it right around the time of his death. And there's a reason he does it right around the time of his death. So let's go over this for a minute, and then I'll talk more about that. So with very few supporters, his theory is either attacked or ignored for about 100 years after his death. So he dies in 1543. And the reason he waited till his death to publish his book was because he didn't have any true evidence to back up his theory. So he didn't know the math behind the planets moving. All he said was, Ptolemy's model is way too complicated. And there's this thing at the time, it's called Occam's razor, which says that the simplest explanation tends to be the correct one. So Nicholas Copernicus just said, well, these epicycles, these circles going around on circles with the deferent, and there's another thing called an equant, which puts the Earth off center from the center. You don't need to worry about that, but there's a thing called an equant. Copernicus just has a problem with these thoughts, and he says it's simpler just to put the Earth and Sun, switch their positions. So now the Earth would be the third planet from the Sun, and the Sun is in the center. It makes the most sense. It's the easiest theory on where the Earth and Sun are to understand. And one of the reasons he doesn't have the evidence for backing his theory up is because he's too busy working for the church. The church keeps him really busy with math, being a mathematician, working on calendar reform and several other things. but he does come up with the idea for heliocentric theory and publishes it in his book. The reason his theory is attacked is because he does it on his deathbed, because if he published this when he was living, there's a chance that he could have been, people in the church, his friends, would actually, no longer see him as being a high member of the church. They would maybe even, consider killing him. So with few supporters, his theory is either ignored or attacked. It's not till later on when we finally get to Galileo, Tycho Brahe, and Kepler where we start seeing people are really, really starting to get this idea for the heliocentric theory and not geocentric theory. So the reason his theory is attacked is because his theory is, this is important here, make sure you understand this, it is no more accurate than Ptolemy's. Even though he's correct, he doesn't have any proof, any evidence to back it up. Therefore, his model is not more accurate, even though it's correct. So his model is no more accurate than Ptolemy's. This is just who I think of whenever I think of Copernicus. So Copernicus and Eddie Vedder. There's Eddie Vedder, and then there's Copernicus. I just like comparing these guys to people that I know from, when I was a little younger. So Copernicus is on the left here. Copernicus was born in 1473 and died in 1543. And then this is Eddie Vedder. So Eddie Vedder was the lead singer of Pearl Jam, and he came out with this great song called Even Flow. If you haven't heard it, it's very good. It's a band of the 90s. So Copernicus is probably thinking heliocentric, whereas Eddie Vedder would be thinking even flow. So Copernicus loves this idea of heliocentric theory, where helio means the sun. It's Greek for the sun. Centric, we've already established that that's Greek for a center, not the earth. It's Greek for center. So I need to change that. It should be center there. So heliocentric, sun-centered. So Copernicus believes the sun is the center because geocentric was too confusing. Ptolemy's model was just too confusing with circles going around on circles. This next guy is probably one of my most favorite astronomers. Not my most favorite, but he's definitely top up there. He's probably my second favorite. To me, he's one of the most interesting men in the world, and his name is Tycho Brahe. So this guy has led a very, very, very interesting, very interesting life. His entire life is like a big soap opera. If you've ever seen the commercials, like with the Dos Equis guy is the most interesting man in the world, that's kind of what Tycho Brahe reminds me of. So Tycho Brahe, he's a Dane, which means he's from Denmark, lived from 1546 to 1601. And he's known as being one of the most accurate observers of all time of space. So keep in mind, in 1546 to 1601, we didn't have telescopes. So he made all his observations with naked eye. They were naked eye observations, which means he didn't use anything to magnify. Really, the tools he did use, he built himself. So this, for instance, this is called a quadrant. Later on this semester, I'll show you what a quadrant is and what it's used for. But he built his own tools, and he was just known as a very, very good observer. And he's very accurate and precise with all his measurements. He's a very good note taker. So Tycho, like I said, he's a very, very interesting guy. When he was born, before he was born, his father and his brother, which means Tycho's uncle, they actually were out one night and they were drinking, and his uncle was sad because he never had any children of his own. And so Tycho's dad said, well, if I ever have a son, you can have mine, just kind of like joking wise. But what ended up happening was when Tycho was born, the uncle showed up to take Tycho away from his mother and father, and the mother and father said, no, you can't have him. And so his uncle actually stole him when he was a baby and ended up raising him as his own child. And Tycho is very, very privileged. He's born into one of the most powerful families in Denmark. So he's got a lot of money. He's got a lot of wealth. He's able to go to school. His family wants him to become a mathematician or a lawyer or a doctor. And Tycho decides he's going to go and become an astronomer. But he's a very, very keen observer, very, very accurate and precise with his measurements. That's important. And so he was able to measure the position of 777 stars without a telescope. and his positions are pretty much dead on. He's very, very, very accurate. And think about how he'd have to do that. So in order to see these stars, he'd have to go outside nightly, every night, for over 20 years. Every single night he'd go outside and do that. Imagine what your life would be like if you had to stay up all night long observing the sky every single night. So he was obviously a night owl. And so think about, when you go outside, sorry, not when you go outside, but when you're up all night long, what are you typically doing to stay awake? When do you typically stay out late at night? A lot of you will probably say, you're at a party or something. And that's what Tycho did a lot. So since he was up all night, every night, he actually partied big time. He was a big partier. And that got him into a lot of trouble, actually. So Tycho, since he's wealthy, he's noble, he's actually friends with the king, King Frederick II of Denmark. And since he becomes friends with the king and becomes the king's scientific advisor, his astronomer, the king builds Tycho an observatory, and he gives him an island. So he gets this island, and he builds this observatory. It's called Uraniborg. And Tycho is there nightly, just observing the stars, the moon, the planets, and just throwing parties pretty much every night he can. He has, and like I said, that got him into trouble. One night he was actually out drinking with his family, his friends, and he got into an argument with his cousin over, I think it was a math problem, a math equation, and they couldn't decide who had the correct answer, and so they actually decided to fight. And when they fought, Tycho actually had his nose sliced off, so he had to wear a prosthetic nose for the rest of his life. Some say it was made of brass, some say it was made of silver, some say it was made of gold, but he had to actually glue a false nose on, and that's what he wore. So he's kind of funny looking. He also had, just at his observatory, he had a midget, a short person, and his name was Jeb. And Jeb was believed to be practiced in the mystical arts and could read your fortune. And he was like a jester for Tycho. So during parties, Jeb would come out from under the table and dance and read people's fortune. And he also had a pet moose, who one night they actually gave him too much alcohol, and the moose fell down the stairs and died. So interesting life that Tycho led. Okay, so this is what Tycho looked like. This is before his nose got cut off. And this is who he reminds me of. So he reminds me of Blue Dove, if you know who that is. He's from a movie called Animal House, and that's the kind of personality that I think of when I think of Tycho Brahe. Very interesting guy. So Tycho, like I said, he was able to observe nightly and keep accurate positions of 777 stars. And he was actually also able to observe a supernova, which is important for later on when we start talking about Galileo. So he observes a supernova, and he comes up with this idea that the sky can actually change. He's seeing a supernova happen, which is just a huge explosion in the sky, in the stars, of a star exploding, and he's able to observe that, which means he sees that stars can change. That's important because before this time, everyone thought that the stars were unchanging, and that we've seen everything there is in the sky. And remember as well, on the last slide, I said Tycho was originally a geocentric. He believed geocentrism. That changes as he gets a little older. He doesn't say heliocentric, but he has it's almost like a geo-heliocentric theory, which we're going to call the Tychonian theory. So this is the Tychonian theory. This is Brahe's theory here. So notice where the Earth is compared to the Sun. So he has the Earth right over here, Moon going around the Earth. Now everything is still going around the Earth, but look where the Sun is. So the Sun is going around the Earth. Mercury and Venus, Mars, Saturn, Jupiter, as they're orbiting around the Earth, they're also orbiting around the Sun. So Mercury and Venus are orbiting around the Sun as it's orbiting around the Earth, and then Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn are also orbiting around the Earth, but they're orbiting around the Sun as well. So that's what Tycho thought. He thought the Sun orbits around the Earth, and the planets are orbiting around the Sun and the Earth. So he's kind of like an intermediate between Ptolemy's model and Copernicus's model, which ends up becoming Really, Copernicus' model becomes really famous when we start talking about Galileo in just a little bit. But like I said, Tycho Brahe led a very interesting life, and even his death is interesting as well. So the way he died, well, there's at the time there were two thoughts to how he died. So Tycho Brahe, obviously, he wasn't very good at math. He was very good at taking accurate observations, but he was not good with math. So he actually hired an assistant. We're trying to talk about him in just a little bit. His name is Johannes Kepler. He's a German mathematician. And a lot of people actually thought that Kepler poisoned Tycho Brahe. And the other story out about Tycho Brahe's death was that he was out one night. He was at the king's palace. And remember, Tycho and the king are really their best friends. And Tycho's drinking a little too much wine before the party even starts. And finally, the party starts, and he keeps drinking and drinking and drinking. And it's a dinner party. So when the king sits down for dinner, that's when everyone has to sit down for dinner, and no one can get up and leave until the king gets up to leave. And so Tycho really had to go to the bathroom really, really badly, but he did not want to dishonor his friend by getting up and leaving. So he just stayed seated, and the king never got up to leave, and Tycho's bladder exploded, which caused him basically to get poisoned on the inside from the urine. So if your bladder explodes, there's no way to excrete the waste, and so it just gets absorbed into your body, and that ended up killing him. So, like I said, very interesting guy, and his body was actually exhumed about, I don't remember the exact year, but a couple of years back, his body was actually exhumed to see what actually killed him, and they do believe it was because his bladder exploded and not that he was poisoned from Johannes Kepler. But like I said, a very interesting guy, which is why I consider him to be like the most interesting man in the world from all the stories he could tell you if you hung out with him back then. This next astronomer is my all-time favorite astronomer of all time. He pretty much revolutionized astronomy as we know it, and he did a lot. He is the guy that finally provided definite evidence to prove that our solar system is a heliocentric solar system and not geocentric, and that is Galileo Galilei. So Galileo, he's most famous for inventing this over here, so this telescope. Now, he invents his version of the telescope in 1609. The actual telescope, the first telescope, was actually invented in 1608 in the Netherlands, but it was not very good. Galileo's hears of the device and then decides he's going to make his own in 1609. And with that telescope, he pretty much changes the face of history forever. So I could probably spend about 2 hours talking to you about Galileo alone. Later on, we're going to watch a video sometime on Galileo, so I'm not going to talk that much about him, but I am going to go over the basics of what he did for astronomy over the next 15 minutes or so. So what I want you to know about Galileo is not born into a wealthy family. You know, he's not this huge, important figure. He's actually a school teacher. So he works for the University of Padua, and he's a teacher, which means he has students living in his home. He's constantly, running around doing things for his classes, and he just gets really, really, really tired of that life. So he hears about this invention called the telescope, and he decides, well, you know what? I bet you I could make my own. And so that's what he does. He decides to make his own telescope, and his telescope is so good. And the reason he decided to make it was so he could sell it for money. That was what he wanted to do. He thought it was an easy way to make a couple extra dollars. And so he makes these telescopes, and he ends up selling them to the government, to the Italian Navy. And so with that, the Navy gives him a lifetime salary for his telescope. And so Galileo starts getting some fame from this invention that he makes, his telescope. And remember, this is new technology. It's never been seen before. So think about new technology. Whenever something's new, it's always really, really expensive. And so this telescope was really, really expensive. So only people that had a bunch of money could afford it. And I mean, why would you want to, spend your money on a telescope? Well, why not? It's a nice thing to have. It's a good way to, guys would have them, and they, impress the ladies with them, basically. It was a way that they could show off that they had money. Now you have people buying fancy cars. Back then, you buy yourself a telescope. That's what they did for entertainment. So Galileo invents this telescope in 1609, and he ends up, like I said, changing the world with his observations he does. So I'm going to try to keep this brief. I'm just going to go over his observations he makes. But again, later on, next week, we're going to watch a video on Galileo, and it goes over in detail his life. But he gets notoriety from this telescope he makes, and he becomes very, very famous and influential. And he knows he's very good in astronomy. He knows all his observations he makes are correct because he has evidence to back it up from using that telescope. Now, people try to argue with him about his evidence, and he just, he doesn't see the point of even arguing with them because he believes they're beneath him because they don't understand the evidence that he has brought back up to support his heliocentric theory. And so Galileo, he ends up actually getting in trouble with the church from having this view of heliocentrism. And he publishes, several papers and books about having a heliocentric theory. And the church gets very, very upset with him, and they actually threaten to kill him if he doesn't recant his view on heliocentric theory. And please keep in mind as well, I mentioned this with Copernicus, Galileo, he is not trying to fight with the church. He loves the church. One of his best friends ends up becoming the Pope. And the Pope actually tells him he can write a book about heliocentric theory. Galileo does. But in the book, Galileo puts forth an argument that if you don't believe in heliocentric theory, then you're dumb. And that was kind of a slap in the face to the Pope. And so the Pope basically has Galileo sent to prison, and Galileo ends up becoming under house arrest for the rest of his life. But don't feel too bad. Galileo has a nice house, and he's getting older at this time, and he actually does a bunch of work in physics, which actually changes, physics as we know it as well. So Galileo is a pretty brilliant man and did some pretty brilliant things in his lifetime. So let's just talk about his observations he made with the telescope, and then we'll keep it at that for this. Okay, so 5 observations he made. A couple of them are already here. So he discovered moons orbiting around Jupiter. That was an important discovery because that showed that not everything in space is orbiting around the Earth. You could use this telescope and you could say, look right there. You can see that there's 4 moons orbiting around Jupiter. Therefore, they're not orbiting around the Earth. They're right there orbiting around Jupiter. And so he makes a couple observations which kind of soften the blow to the church. He's slowly trying to build up a case that says the Earth can't be the center of the universe. The one observation that puts a nail in the coffin for geocentric universe is the phases of Venus. So he said Venus goes through phases just like our moon does. The only way that could happen is if the sun were the center of the universe and the Earth were the third planet out from the sun. That is the only way Venus can go through phases. So that's really what proved heliocentric theory and killed geocentric theory. But we have to know his 5 observations that got to that point. So this is what Galileo looked like. So very, very clever guy, very smart. Notice the big beard, which means he's really wise. He's an Italian astronomer, mathematician, physics. He did it all. He never married. He did have a mistress that lived in his house in Padua, and he ended up having a few kids from her. In the movie that we're going to watch eventually, you'll hear about one of them, his daughter. So here are his observations. We'll talk about each one of these one at a time. So mountains on the moon. So with Galileo's telescope, he was able to see that the moon had surface features. Before this time, he actually, everyone looked at the moon and they thought it was just a flat, a perfectly round sphere with nothing on it. And Galileo was the first person to use a telescope to actually look up the moon. And it's pretty incredible. Think about how exciting that'd be to be the first person to do something in history. And that's what Galileo did. So he looked up the moon, and all he did was draw some pictures of what he saw. And he ended up publishing a book on his pictures of the moon like 2 weeks later. And it sold out. First publication sold out in no time. And that's really what made Galileo famous. he was able to publish these works from his pictures he had from using his telescope. So mountains on the moon just shows that the moon is not perfect. It has features just like the Earth does. Phases of Venus, we already said that that's what definitely without a doubt proves heliocentrism and not geocentrism. Moons around Jupiter. There's 4 moons that orbit around Jupiter. That proves that there are things out there in space that don't orbit around the Earth. Spots on the sun. That's very similar to what we said a minute ago with mountains on the moon. So it proves the sun is not perfect in that there's features to the sun. So before we thought, the Earth was the only thing with features. All these objects in the sky were just these big circles, these big spheres with nothing on them. Galileo is saying that there's spots on the sun, and that mountains are on the moon. And then the 5th observation, he observed stars not seen without a telescope. Before the telescope was around, we thought we had seen everything in space. So all those stars, those 850 stars that Hipparchus saw, that was it. There was nothing else out there. And what Galileo did was he said, no, look between these 2 stars. You'll see that there's a lot of other stars out there. Look between these 2 stars. You'll see there's a lot of other stars out there. So he was able to prove that we do not know everything about space. There's a lot up there that we do not know about. So with these 5 observations, he helped prove heliocentrism and he killed geocentrism. So sorry about that. That's annoying. How did this contradict Aristotle's system of the heavens that the Catholic Church loves so much? It was the exact opposite. So Aristotle believed Earth was the center, it didn't move, everything was revolving around the Earth. Galileo said, nope, everything's revolving around the sun. The Earth is moving. The reason we can't feel it is because we're moving at the same pace as the Earth. And that just made sense to him. He was able to reason through that. He thought of an experiment to do, and he didn't even really have to do the experiment because it just made sense. Now, so Galileo, he becomes an old man, and after he publishes his book, he's old, and he gets in trouble with the church from publishing that book. The book is called The Dialogue, and you'll hear more about that in the movie. But in the book, basically, he has a character in his book. There's 3 characters. There's a very, very smart, intelligent old man who believes in heliocentric theory. Then there's a man that doesn't have any view, and he wants to know more about both views. And then the third guy is one that believes in geocentric theory. And Galileo actually calls him, his name is Simplicio, which basically means the simpleton. So, and he basically takes the Pope's words and puts them in Simplicio's mouth. And that makes the Pope very, very upset with Galileo. And so Galileo, he's threatened to be beheaded if he doesn't recant his views. So he says, yes, I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking. Obviously, heliocentrism isn't correct. I've never believed in heliocentric theory. I believe in geocentric theory. And he had to say that so that he wouldn't be put to death. So instead of being put to death, beheaded, he was just sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. And even today, the Catholic Church still says, it was just a very unfortunate incident that happened with Galileo. They've never actually come out and apologized completely for what they did to him. So during his life, Galileo's life, he didn't get, after that happened, nothing else happened with his work. It wasn't until years later that everyone changed their mind and they really started to believe in Galileo and Galileo's work. So he's very influential now, but he wasn't at this time when he gets arrested, unfortunately. And so the next person we're going to talk about is Johannes Kepler. We're going to start with him tomorrow. The next time I do notes, we're going to talk about Kepler and Newton because there's some math involved and there's 3 laws involved for each of them. So I told you before that Johannes Kepler, he is a German mathematician that worked with Tycho Brahe, and we'll do him and Isaac Newton the next time I give you a lecture. So thank you for listening to this, and you guys have a good day.